I heard the water running in the bathroom, the steady stream cascading against the porcelain, muffled by the half-closed door. My husband had left early for work and I was alone in the house, or so I had thought. Walking down the hallway, I reached for my phone on the counter when the bathroom door swung open. The sight hit me like a jolt of electricity. He stood there, a towel hanging loosely around his hips, his damp skin glistening under the morning light that filtered through the window. Droplets of water slid down his chest, tracing the firm ridges of muscle before disappearing beneath the fabric. His dark eyes met mine and for a second, just a second, something flickered between us. A charged silence. A hesitation that was almost imperceptible. I should have looked away. I should have muttered an apology and turned on my heel. Instead I stood frozen, my pulse betraying me with its rapid, erratic rhythm. "Morning," he said, his voice casual, as if nothing about this moment was unusual. I swallowed hard. "I didn't realize you were staying over. Your husband said it was fine." He tilted his head slightly, observing me as if he could see past my carefully composed expression. I nodded, forcing myself to break the moment to move. "Right. Coffee's in the kitchen if you want some." My voice came out steadier than I felt. I walked away, my bare feet cool against the hardwood floor, but I could still feel his gaze on my back. The rest of the morning was a battle against my own thoughts. I busied myself with laundry, wiped the already clean countertops, anything to shake off the lingering sensation in my chest. But it was useless. The image of him, standing there, effortless, confident, kept flashing in my mind like a forbidden temptation. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. By the time he joined me in the kitchen, dressed now in jeans and a fitted shirt, I had composed myself. Or at least I thought I had. "You seem distracted," he said, pouring himself a cup of coffee. I let out a small laugh, shaking my head. "Just a lot on my mind." "You sure?" His tone was teasing, playful, but there was an undercurrent of something else. Curiosity, maybe even amusement. I turned to face him. "Why are you asking?" He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving mine. "You were staring at me earlier." He crawled up my neck. "I wasn't." "You were." I exhaled sharply, shaking my head, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Don't flatter yourself." He smirked but didn't push further. Instead he leaned against the counter, too close yet not close enough. "Relax," he said, his voice lower now. "I won't tell anyone." Something in the way he said it, like he knew exactly what was happening inside my head, made my breath catch. I had to get out of this moment before I did something reckless. That night, as I lay in bed next to my husband, I stared at the ceiling, listening to the sound of his steady breathing. Everything in our life was perfect. We had stability, trust, a life built together. So why was my heart racing now, not from the warmth beside me but from the thought of someone else? I closed my eyes, forcing myself to push it all away. It was nothing. A fleeting moment. It had to be. The following days passed in a blur of routine, but something had shifted. I felt it in the way my pulse quickened when I heard footsteps approaching, in the way my skin tingled when he walked into the room. Every interaction, no matter how casual, held a weight that hadn't been there before. I convinced myself I was imagining it, that this was nothing more than a fleeting moment of distraction. I was wrong. The evening was warm, and the house was filled with the soft murmur of conversation. Family dinner. Casual, comfortable. My husband sat across from me, laughing at something his brother said. And beside me, too close for comfort, sat him. His arm brushed against mine as he reached for the wine, the touch so brief yet so deliberate that it sent a sharp current through me. I barely tasted the food on my plate. From the outside I looked composed, engaged in conversation, nodding at the right moments. But inside my thoughts were spiraling. Was it in my head? Or was he doing this on purpose? Later, as I cleared the dishes, he followed me into the kitchen. "You're quiet tonight," he said, leaning casually against the counter. I focused on rinsing a plate. "Just tired." "Liar." His voice was low, teasing. I turned to face him, irritation flaring in me, not at him but at myself for how easily I reacted. "Excuse me." He stepped closer, invading my space without touching me. "You're avoiding me." I scoffed, shaking my head. "Don't be ridiculous." His smirk deepened. "Then why won't you look at me?" I clenched my jaw. "Because there's nothing to look at." A bold lie. His gaze dropped, just for a second, to my lips, then back to my eyes. The air between us was electric, charged with something neither of us wanted to name. The sound of footsteps approaching broke the moment, and I turned abruptly, busying myself with the sink. When I finally risked a glance over my shoulder, he was gone. But the heat remained. That night I stood in front of the mirror, running a brush through my hair. I should have been thinking about my husband, about our life together, about how lucky I was. Instead, I was thinking about how close he had stood to me. How his voice had curled around my thoughts and refused to let go. I shook my head as if the motion alone could erase the feeling. This was nothing. A passing moment. But deep down I already knew I was playing with fire. And I wasn't sure I wanted to stop. Started with something small. A casual moment. An accident. At least that's what I told myself. My husband was away for the weekend. An unexpected business trip. The house was quieter without him, the silence amplifying the thoughts I had been trying to suppress. I told myself it was just another evening, nothing out of the ordinary. I wore comfortable clothes, poured myself a glass of wine and curled up on the couch trying to focus on the book in my hands. Then the doorbell rang. I knew who it was before I even opened the door. He leaned against the frame, hands shoved into his pockets, that same knowing smirk on his lips. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said, stepping inside before I could answer. "You always assume I have nothing better to do?" I shot back, closing the door behind him. "Not at all," he murmured, glancing at my wine glass. "Just figured you could use the company." I sighed, walking back to the couch. "You always have a way of showing up at the worst times." He sat beside me, closer than necessary, his body heat radiating through the space between us. "Or the best times," he countered. I took another sip of wine, pretending the way his presence affected me was nothing more than an annoyance. But the truth was, I had been waiting for something to happen. And it did. It was stupid, really. A simple reach for the remote control, both of us moving at the same time. His fingers brushed against mine, a brief, accidental touch that sent a jolt of awareness straight through me. I should have pulled away. I should have laughed it off. But I didn't. Neither did he. Instead, his fingers lingered, his touch light but deliberate. I turned my head and our eyes met. And that was it. That was all it took. His lips were on mine before I even had the chance to think. A slow, hesitant kiss at first, as if we were both waiting for the other to pull away. I didn't. He didn't. The hesitation melted into something deeper, something that made my breath hitch and my heart slam against my ribs. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to feel right. But it did. The sound of my own gasp broke the moment and I pulled back sharply, my chest rising and falling as if I had run a marathon. His gaze was dark, unreadable. I swallowed hard. This is a mistake. Is it? His voice was quiet, but there was something challenging in it. I stood up, forcing distance between us. "You should go." For a second I thought he was going to argue. But then he nodded, pushing himself up from the couch. As he walked past me, he hesitated. "Tell me to stop and I will." I clenched my fist. I just did. He studied me for a moment longer, then left. I stood there, staring at the door, my lips still tingling from his kiss. And for the first time I knew, this wasn't over. The next morning, everything was the same. The sun still rose, my husband still called from the airport, my coffee still tasted bitter without sugar. But inside me everything had changed. I couldn't escape the feeling of his lips against mine, the way his breath had mixed with mine, the way I had let it happen. And worse, I wanted more. I spent the day trying to convince myself otherwise. It was a mistake. A lapse in judgment. A moment of weakness that wouldn't happen again. But the lie felt paper thin. Because deep down I knew, mistakes weren't supposed to feel this good. When evening came, I told myself I wouldn't think about him. I picked out a simple dress. Nothing too revealing, nothing that clung too tightly. But as I stood in front of the mirror, I found myself reaching for something else. Something softer. Something that made my skin feel alive against the fabric. My fingers brushed over my collarbone and I shivered, remembering the heat of his touch. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply. Oh, I was not going to fall deeper into this. But my body was already betraying me. When I entered the dining room that evening, I knew instantly that he was there. He sat across from me, his expression unreadable, his posture relaxed. But his eyes said everything. There was no hesitation. No regret. Only hunger. And I felt it too. Dinner was a silent war. The table was full, conversations flowing around us, but I barely heard a word. All I could focus on was the way his fingers tapped against his glass. The way his tongue flicked against his bottom lip. The way my own skin burned with the memory of our kiss. And when his foot brushed against mine under the table, light barely there, I almost dropped my fork. I bit the inside of my cheek, fighting the shiver that threatened to expose me. After dinner, I escaped to the kitchen, needing air, needing space. But I should have known he would follow. The moment I turned around, he was there. Silent. Moving. Watching. My breath hitched. You can't do that. Do what? His voice was infuriatingly calm. That, I gestured vaguely, frustration curling in my chest. You know exactly what. He stepped closer. If you want me to stop, tell me. I swallowed hard, my back pressing against the counter. I did. His head tilted slightly. And yet here we are. I opened my mouth, ready to say something sharp, something that would put an end to this once and for all. But then his fingers brushed against my wrist. And I felt it again, that pull, that undeniable force that neither of us seemed capable of resisting. I closed my eyes, my body betraying me as I leaned the tiniest fraction forward. Tell me to leave, he murmured, his breath warm against my cheek. I opened my eyes. And I said nothing. I should have told him to leave. I should have stepped back, put space between us, ended whatever this was before it spiraled out of control. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I stood there, every nerve in my body alert, every breath shallow. His fingers lingered against my wrist, light as if waiting for my reaction. Testing me. And when I didn't pull away, he smirked, just the slightest curve of his lips. He knew. I wasn't stopping this. The air between us grew thick, charged with something we no longer had the strength to fight. Tell me you don't want this, he said, voice low. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. He exhaled a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Yeah. That's what I thought. I swallowed hard. This is dangerous. His fingers trailed up my forearm, his touch barely there, yet it sent a wildfire through my veins. Then why aren't you moving? He whispered. I should have. But my body betrayed me once again. The sound of footsteps in the hallway snapped me back to reality. I jumped away from him, heart hammering against my ribs. A second later, my husband's voice called out. Are you in the kitchen? I sucked in a breath, forcing my face into something neutral. Yeah, I answered, my voice steadier than I felt. He walked in, completely unaware of the storm that had just passed through the room. My husband wrapped an arm around my waist, pressing a soft kiss to my temple. Warm. Familiar. Safe. And yet all I could think about was the man standing across the room. Watching. Waiting. And the fire still smoldering between us. That night I lay in bed next to my husband, staring at the ceiling. His arm draped over my waist, his breath steady and warm against my shoulder. Everything should have felt normal. But it didn't. I turned slightly, looking at his sleeping face, feeling a deep, unsettling guilt coil in my stomach. I loved him. Didn't I? I closed my eyes, exhaling shakily. Then why was I aching for someone else? The next day I told myself it was over. I avoided him. Refused to be alone with him. It was reckless. Stupid. A mistake. But by evening my resolve had already begun to crack. I caught myself looking for him, listening for his voice, feeling that gnawing emptiness when he wasn't near. It was an addiction. A hunger I couldn't suppress. And I had no idea how to stop it. I had spent the entire day avoiding him. I convinced myself that if I could just push through, if I could ignore the pull, the fire, the hunger, then maybe, just maybe, I could put an end to this before it consumed me. But that was a lie. Because the truth was, I wasn't running away from him. I was waiting for him to come to me. It was late when I finally found myself alone. The house was quiet, my husband gone for the evening, out with friends. I stood in the dimly lit kitchen, gripping the counter, trying to steady myself. I shouldn't have been disappointed that he hadn't come looking for me. I shouldn't have wanted him to. But the ache in my chest was undeniable. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. Enough. This has to stop. I turned, ready to leave. And then I froze. He was standing in the doorway. Watching. Waiting. Like he knew I had been waiting for him too. He didn't speak at first. Didn't need to. The space between us was thick with everything unspoken, everything we had tried and failed to resist. I swallowed hard. You shouldn't be here. His lips twitched. then tell me to leave. It was the same challenge as before. The same dare. I should have told him to go. Should have walked away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because I was tired. Tired of fighting something that had already won. He stepped closer. Slow. Deliberate. Like a hunter closing in on its prey. You're shaking, he murmured. I let out a breathy laugh. I should be. His gaze dipped to my lips. I knew what was coming. And this time I didn't stop it. The moment his lips touched mine, something inside me snapped. The hesitation from the first time was gone. This kiss wasn't a mistake. It was a choice. Deliberate. Unforgivable. My hands found his shirt, gripping the fabric as if holding on to him could steady the storm raging inside me. He groaned against my mouth, his hands sliding up my arms, my back, his touch igniting every nerve in my body. I pressed closer, needing more. More of this feeling. More of him. More of the danger that made my heart race in a way it hadn't in years. A loud thud from the hallway shattered the moment. We broke apart, both of us breathing hard, reality crashing back around us. I stared at him, my lips still tingling, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my ears. That can't happen again, I whispered. His expression darkened. You don't believe that? I swallowed, stepping back. I have to. A muscle ticked in his jaw. He looked at me for a long, tense second. Then he turned and left. I stood there long after he was gone, my fingers touching my lips, my body still burning with the imprint of his hands. I had told him it couldn't happen again. But the truth? It already had. And I wasn't sure I wanted to stop. I tried to pretend nothing had happened. The next morning I forced myself into my routine. Coffee, emails, laundry, anything to drown out the memory of his lips on mine, the way his hands had felt on my skin. I told myself it was just a mistake. A single moment of weakness. But I wasn't fooling anyone. Because the truth was, I had never felt more alive. By the afternoon I was restless. I needed to get out of the house. I grabbed my keys and left, driving aimlessly through the city, my hands gripping the wheel too tightly. I couldn't escape it. Couldn't escape him. Every red light, every turn, my mind kept drifting back, to the way he had looked at me. The way he had kissed me like he knew I would kiss him back. I pulled into a parking lot, resting my forehead against the steering wheel. What the hell was I doing? This wasn't me. I was in control. I made the rules. But now, I was breaking them. And I didn't know how to stop. My phone buzzed. I hesitated before looking at the screen. A message. From him. Where are you? Just 3 words. 3 words that sent a rush through me so intense I almost dropped my phone. I shouldn't have answered. I should have ignored it. Instead my fingers moved on their own. Out. Why? A few seconds later, another message. Meet me. My heart pounded. I didn't reply right away. I stared at the words, knowing that this was it. The moment where I could still walk away. Still pretend like I had control over this. But I wasn't walking away. I was running straight toward the fire. 15 minutes later, I pulled into a small, secluded parking lot. He was already there, leaning against his car, arms crossed. Waiting. The moment I stepped out, his eyes locked onto mine. A storm. That's what it felt like I had walked straight into a storm that had been building for weeks, waiting to tear everything apart. I swallowed hard. This is a bad idea. Probably, he said. Neither of us moved. Neither of us blinked. And then, in the space of a single breath, we crashed into each other. It wasn't slow this time. It wasn't hesitant. It was hungry, desperate, reckless. His hands were on my waist, pulling me closer. My fingers tangled in his hair, gripping, kneading, taking. Every kiss, every touch, every sharp inhale was a confession. One we could no longer deny. This wasn't just wanting anymore. It was needing. And we were past the point of no return. When we finally pulled apart, my head was spinning, my breath unsteady. His forehead rested against mine, our bodies still pressed together. We're gonna get caught, I whispered. His fingers traced slow circles on my hip. Do you care? I should have said yes. I should have walked away. But instead I whispered the only truth I had left. No. The night felt endless, the air heavy with things we didn't speak about. We hadn't made plans, we hadn't discussed what came next. We didn't need to. In that moment we both understood. There was no turning back. I woke up with the sun streaming through the blinds, the soft light cutting across the room. But it wasn't the morning that jarred me. It was the realization that I had spent the night in his arms. His warmth still lingered against my skin, the faint trace of his scent in the air. I sat up slowly, my fingers brushing the sheets beside me, the bed already cold where he had been. I should have left. I should have made an excuse. But no matter how many times I repeated it in my head, the truth didn't change. I had chosen this. I spent the rest of the day avoiding the thoughts that threatened to overwhelm me. The quiet moments of our last encounter ran in a loop in my head, like a broken record, echoing louder and louder until it was all I could hear. I couldn't stop thinking about him. And I knew it was a problem. It was a dangerous problem. When my husband called that evening, I found myself distracted, my mind miles away. He spoke about his day, about meetings and work and things I used to care about. But now, all I could focus on was the way my fingers ached to feel him again. I smiled and nodded at the right moments, my voice automatic, trying to ignore the knot of guilt tightening in my stomach. At the end of the conversation, he told me he was coming home early the next day. Great, I said, trying to sound more enthusiastic than I felt. I'll make dinner. Looking forward to it, he said, and I could hear the tiredness in his voice. I hung up and stood there holding the phone, feeling the weight of what I had just done. But it didn't matter. Because my mind was already elsewhere. I didn't have to wait long. That night, after I had finished cleaning up, he was there. I didn't invite him in. I didn't need to. He stepped inside without a word, the door shutting behind him with a soft click. There was no hesitation now. We were past the point of playing games. The tension between us had reached a breaking point, the kind of pressure that cracks everything open. He kissed me again, this time slower, deeper, as if we had all the time in the world. But I knew better. We didn't have time. We never did. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice rough with something darker. I swallowed hard, meeting his gaze. No. His lips curled into a smile. Then why are you still here? Because I couldn't leave. I couldn't stop myself. I moved closer, my hands trembling as I touched him, the need in me almost painful. And just like that, I made my choice. We didn't speak after that. There was nothing to say. The consequences were already hanging over us and neither of us cared. It was reckless. It was selfish. But in that moment, all that mattered was the feeling of his hands on my skin, the heat of his mouth on mine, the wildness of something I had never known I was capable of. The next morning, I woke up alone again. But this time, the absence didn't sting. I had already made my decision. And there was no going back. I woke up with a sense of inevitable weight pressing on my chest. The last few days had been a blur of stolen moments and quiet whispers, but this morning something felt different. Something felt like it was on the verge of breaking. I stood in front of the mirror, my reflection staring back at me with wide, unsettled eyes. There was a tightness in my chest, a nagging sense of dread that I couldn't shake. I had gotten so used to this secret, this hidden part of myself, but I felt the walls closing in. I could no longer pretend. I spent the morning trying to push the thoughts away, forcing myself to go through the motions. Coffee, laundry, cleaning. But in every corner of the house I saw reminders of my other life, the life I was supposed to be living. The life I had promised my husband. The life that now felt like a lie. My phone buzzed and my heart skipped a beat. It was him. The message was short, but the weight of it was overwhelming. I can't stop thinking about you. I read it again and again until the words burned into my mind. I had been avoiding him. I had been telling myself that I was stronger than this. But here I was, about to make a decision I knew I couldn't take back. I texted back, my hands trembling. We need to talk. It was only a few minutes later when I saw his car pull into the driveway. I didn't even have time to process it before the door opened, and there he was, standing in the entryway, his eyes dark like a storm was about to break. I could feel the tension between us, palpable in the air. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could hear my breath, shallow and fast, my heart racing with a mix of guilt and desire. How much longer are we going to pretend this isn't happening? He asked, his voice low, rough with something darker than I was ready to face. I swallowed. I don't know. Yes, you do. He stepped closer and his presence felt like fire. This isn't just a mistake anymore. It's what we both want. I recoiled slightly, but my body didn't want to listen. I didn't want to back away. I wanted to give in to the pull, to the need that had been building between us. I'm married, I whispered, my voice trembling. I can't do this. Then why are we standing here? He was so close now, his breath mingling with mine. Why do I feel like you're asking me to stay? The truth hit me like a freight train, something so raw I couldn't ignore it any longer. I wasn't asking him to stay. I was asking him to save me. His lips crashed into mine, and for a split second I was lost in it. The heat, the desire, the overwhelming need to be wanted in a way that felt dangerous. I had wanted to stop. I had told myself 100 times I would stop. But in that moment I knew it was too late. I didn't want to stop. I pulled away, breathless. We can't do this anymore. He looked at me, his eyes searching mine as if trying to find something he couldn't name. We can't stop, and you know it. His words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken, the inevitable truth we had both been avoiding. It was then that I heard the sound. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway. It was him. My husband. My heart dropped into my stomach as I turned to the door, panic rising in my chest. He's home. I could feel his presence behind me, but I didn't turn to look at him. I couldn't. Leave, I whispered. No. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. Not until you tell me it's over. His voice was a demand, a plea. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The sound of footsteps in the hallway grew louder. And then the door opened. I froze. My husband stood in the doorway, eyes wide, his gaze darting between us. There was no hiding it anymore. No more pretending. He had seen everything. The room was silent, suffocating. I felt my pulse in my throat, the air thick with the weight of the moment. The weight of everything I had done, and everything that was about to unravel. My husband stood there, his gaze flicking between us, his face pale, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something deeper, something far more dangerous. I had no words. There was nothing left to say. For a moment it felt as if time had stopped. The world outside the walls of the house didn't exist anymore. All that mattered was the man standing in the doorway, staring at me, the truth written all over his face. You. His voice cracked. How long? The question hung in the air, and I could feel the pressure of it, the sting of his disappointment, the hurt that was already sinking deep into his chest. I didn't answer. I couldn't. His gaze shifted to the man standing across the room from me, the man who had been the cause of this whole mess. You. He repeated as if seeing him for the first time. The betrayal was too much. Both of you. I didn't know what to say. There was no apology that could make this right. There was no excuse I could offer that would make him understand. I had failed him. He turned away from us, his back stiff, his fists clenched at his sides. He walked across the room, not looking back, not even acknowledging that I was standing there. And then he stopped. He paused at the door to the hallway as if debating whether he should say something else, something that would explain everything, make sense of the chaos. But he didn't. He just left. I stood there, my legs like jelly beneath me, the guilt and shame crushing me into the floor. I wanted to run after him, to beg him to come back, to tell him I didn't mean for any of this to happen. But I knew. It was too late. I felt his presence before I turned around. The other man, the one I had been lying to, the one I had betrayed in the worst possible way. He was watching me, but there was no softness left in his eyes. He had seen everything. He had witnessed the broken pieces of my marriage splintering in front of him. And I knew he was angry. He had every right to be. But what could I say now? Was it worth it? His voice was quiet, but it cut through me like a knife. I couldn't speak. I just stood there, staring at him as if words could somehow repair the damage I had caused. But they wouldn't. I don't know. He took a step closer, his body stiff with anger and frustration. You don't know. He shook his head. You don't know? After all this? I didn't plan for this. I didn't want it to happen, I whispered, my voice barely audible. He laughed bitterly. Doesn't matter, does it? The damage is done. The choice was made. I wanted to run to him, to beg for his forgiveness, but I couldn't move. I couldn't bring myself to cross that final line because deep down I knew he was right. There was no going back. For a long time neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, an ocean of unspoken words, of unspoken feelings that would never be voiced. And then finally he spoke again, his voice raw with emotion. You'll have to live with this. His words were a punch to my gut. I know, I whispered, barely able to breathe. Will you? He paused, his gaze fixed on me. Will you really live with it? Or will you just keep running like you've been doing this whole time? I didn't have an answer. I didn't know how to answer him because the truth was, I had been running. From him. From my husband. From myself. And now here I was with nowhere to hide. I looked up at him, my heart pounding, tears welling in my eyes. "I'm sorry." He didn't respond. He didn't have to.